Spirit of life, God, Goddess, of many names, all holy, we lift up those who have shared joys and sorrows, and those that still remain unspoken. We lift up those who are suffering losses and grieving, those who are ill or have loved ones experiencing illness, those who are depressed, isolated, feeling alone. To those experiencing physical pain, may all those suffering find relief and seek the support of community. May we remember our many gratitudes, the beauty of our world, and the beautiful moments of our lives. And may we work to create and appreciate more of them. May we hold our precious lives in reverence and cultivate the good in our hearts, leaving the seeds of anger and selfishness within ourselves unwatered. May we never hesitate to act out our love, our values in the world. In the name of all that is loving, all that is just, and all that is peaceful and life-affirming. Amen. So today's title is Reverence and Repairing the World. And I can't think of a better person to quote to begin to explain what that might look like than the poet, naturalist writer, Wendell Berry. Here is what he has to say about the condition of our life and our planet right now. We have lived by the assumption that what was good for us would be good for the world. And this has been based on the even flimsier assumption that we could know with any certainty what was good even for us. We have fulfilled the danger of this by making our personal pride and greed the standard of our behavior toward the world, to the incalculable disadvantage of the world and every living thing in it. And now, perhaps very close to too late, our great error has become clear. It is not only our own creativity, our own capacity for life that is stifled by our arrogant assumption. The creation itself is stifled. We have been wrong. We must change our lives so that it will be possible to live by the contrary assumption that what is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make the effort to know the world and to learn what is good for it. We must learn to cooperate in its processes and yield to its limits. But even more important, we must learn to acknowledge that the creation is full of mystery. We will never entirely understand it. We must abandon arrogance and stand in awe. We must recover the sense of the majesty of creation and the ability to be worshipful in its presence. For I do not doubt that it is only on the condition of humility and reverence before the world that our species will be able to remain in it. So I consider that a mic drop moment from Wendell Berry, a sad but true mic drop moment. He makes a really good case of reverence for the natural world as a potential to actually save the world and thus save ourselves. He says that until we abandon our arrogance and stand in awe, there really is no viable path forward. And I have to admit, what he's talking about is kind of different from what we were all taught in school or in church about what to value. It's a lot of awe and reverence for the natural world, something I think we're all taught to take somewhat for granted. What will it actually take for us, including myself in all of this, to really decrease our environmental footprints, lower our so-called standard of living, consume less, and perhaps most importantly, devote more hours to political work and activist work to address the fact that our planet and the human beings on it are doomed unless we take more drastic action. There is a lot that is too late to fix, but that's no excuse to provide the best possible future for our children and grandchildren. But yet, this is not going to be a sermon on climate change, which is still a very worthy topic, a topic for which I feel a lot of helplessness and sadness, to the point where it's almost easier to ignore it, which I also know is a very dangerous thing. But this sermon is focused more about how we develop that awe and humility, or what that may look like for us, that awe and humility that Wendell Berry is talking about, and doing it in a theological way, because it's really this sense of awe and humility and putting the natural world first as the ultimate thing that just might make us as a society, as a nation and a world, want to do more to save it and its inhabitants. So fortunately, the idea of reverence towards nature is not really a hard sell for most UUs. I mean, even the most urban and indoorsy of us who don't like to get our hands dirty, we still have a tendency to appreciate the natural world, even if it's simply through looking out a window or watching a nature program or reading books or magazines. But for those of us that hold the natural world in the highest regard, there is a theology for that. Actually, there's more than one theology for that. We've got our earth-centered and indigenous traditions that are spoken of in our sixth source of Unitarian Universalism. We've got our neo-pagan and Wiccan traditions, which hold the natural world very highly. But the theology I'm talking about today comes actually out of academics, theological study. And this particular theology is called Religious Naturalism. And it is a favorite theology of any Unitarian Universalists who are usually introduced to it. And I'm talking about this not because I see everyone being converted into a religious naturalist, or that might happen, but I think it's important that we take items of use in various theologies to incorporate them as in their own. So I think there's a lot of useful stuff in here, even if you're not going to become a card-carrying religious naturalist, if that's actually a thing, which I'm not so sure it is. And it's just good to know about how expansive theology is. We come from a tradition of liberal theology. That's what UUs study in seminary. And that theology, although the word theology, theo, means God, liberal theology has transcended the concept of God that we find in the big three religions. It's transcended that particular concept of God, and it's kind of moved on to the possibility of no God at all being in the equation. So if you think of theology in that way, you might find it the idea a little less disturbing and more interesting. So religious naturalism, this particular theology, it prioritizes the whole natural world over anything else, including human beings, right? The whole world over human beings alone. And it really does sort of take the human down a few notches, as they kind of tend to get too full of themselves, just as what Wendell Berry says is needed. So to break down the religious and the naturalism parts of religious naturalism, I'm going to start with naturalism. So when we think of nature, we tend to think of natural outdoor spaces. But naturalism and religious naturalism is talking about more than just what's going outside in our backyard. Nature and religious naturalism includes the whole natural world and the whole natural universe. So this church is part of the natural world. The chairs are part of the natural world just as much as the people in them. All human-made things are part of the natural world, and as are all of us. So nature, to religious naturalists, is basically everything that is real and concrete in this world, in this universe. And they often tend to think that that's all there is, right? The earth, the universe. So one way to think of naturalism in this sense is that it's the opposite of supernaturalism. So now let's talk about the religious part of religious naturalism. There's a professor named Ursula Goodenough, I love that name, She's a professor of cell biology and molecular evolution at Washington University, and she's also one of the most prominent religious naturalists out there. Ursula Goodenough says that in the same way traditional religions are based on core narratives, based on a big story, like the Hebrew Bible, that's the big story in Judaism. Jesus is the big story in Christianity. You know what the big story in Islam would be. Well, all religions have these big stories. So the big story for the religious naturalist are stories, narratives around science and evolution and human discovery. And just as the more traditionally religious naturalists go on to explore their big story, the religious potential of this big story, and they develop interpretive and spiritual and moral ethical responses to it. So just in the ways Christians may use the Bible as a source of wisdom and interpretation, and they use it for spiritual and moral and ethical responses to it, religious naturalists do that. But instead, their source is the natural universe itself. And religious naturalism, as you may have guessed, requires no God or deity for it to work. The idea is that nature is all there is. And Goodenough says the concept of a God that actively alters the course of events is not a naturalist view. And she says if you find this type of God important, you will presumably prefer another theological space. But on the flip side, she says that some people who identify as naturalists may not like that religious part. They see the idea of being religious as unacceptable, so they'll probably just be regular naturalists instead of religious naturalists. So most religious naturalists don't use God language, but sometimes they use it in a more metaphorical or a different type of sense. They might use the word as a personification of reality, or to name the unknown or the unknowable. God is the ground of being, or to describe a large and important concept within the natural world, like God is love, God is creativity. But they're usually not referring to the guy sitting on a throne in the sky with a beard. The Reverend Dr. Jerome Stone, another prominent religious naturalist theologian, he describes God and religious naturalism a little differently. He says that religious naturalism can encompass both those who find it important to talk about God and those who prefer to not talk about God at all. He says they usually fall into three groups when it comes to God. There are religious naturalists who conceive of God as the creative process within the universe. So God isn't a personification, God is a process. And there are also those who think of God as the totality of the universe. Everything in the universe, that's God. Again, not a personification, not a human-like deity. The third group of religious naturalists don't talk about God, but they still are okay with being called religious because they often relate to the world itself with a very religious feeling. And Jerome Stone himself, he calls what he calls a minimum definition of God, which he says he can use in ordinary conversation, and he can use it leading in worship that includes theists and non-theists. And he uses it when he's talking to people from other religious traditions. And his definition of God is worth reading twice. His definition is the sum total of the ecosystem, community, and person, empowering and demanding interactions in the universe. The sum total of the ecosystem, community, and person, empowering and demanding interactions in the universe. That's Jerome Stone's God. But to make this more concrete and about how, in his life, how his theology works on a daily basis, he's talked about some of his most profound spiritual experiences, his most profound experiences of the sacred. And he gives two very different examples. He talks about the day his father died, when he was home in the apartment feeling sad, and his 8-year-old daughter came home from school. He told her what had happened, and she said, "Oh, Dad," and put her arm around him. He described that as one of the most comforting, supportive, and sacred moments of his life. And here is another sacred moment of his life, very different from the first phone poll. Now, that might not be my idea of a spiritual moment, but stay with it. So he says it gave he and his wife, witnessing this thing, it gave them both a thrill at the excellence of the hunter and a vivid realization that this life and death struggle was playing out before them, and it was something happening completely apart from their own lives and their own concerns. So he sees these sacred moments of illumination, and reflection upon these sacred moments really worked to shape his philosophy of life. So he could gather a lot of meaning and interpretation of life's events, both from his daughter comforting him, his 8-year-old little daughter comforting him, and from this example of the food chain, I should say. So Jerome Stone, I'm going to share a quote from him, and it's a longer one, but I'm going to kind of stop and maybe give some context on the way. It's really good stuff here, but sometimes, like with theology, reading theology, it's a little heady, and it doesn't read as well out loud, actually. So, but he says, given to his commitment, a philosophy of naturalism, sacred events are not understood as manifestations of something otherworldly. All of the world religions, as I understand them, he says, speak of going beyond the surface understanding of life. My naturalistic outlook suggests to me that the deeper vision we seek to attain is not of another realm or of invisible spirits, but rather a revised insight into the importance of things. There is a depth, not apart from, but right here among the things of life. So in traditional religion, you go to the beyond, to the deity, to get the deep. And he's saying the deep, the depth, the meaning of the existence is in the here and now. He says, which I find to be very true, there are no clear boundaries around the sacred. Some events are clearly sacred. Others are perhaps boundary line cases, right? Borderline cases. Is this sacred? Is this not? I don't know. And it's not always possible to know whether some events or places are sacred, for sure. It's not a, cut and dry thing. He says, perhaps this means that everything is sacred, although I am not sure that we are capable of sustaining such a sense. And yes, we can talk about everything being sacred and has the potential. We have that song the band does about everything being holy now. But in practical everyday life, if everything we encountered was sacred, I think it would be hard to kind of move and live a somewhat normal life and maybe not be locked up for seeming insane. But he says the sacred is not a separate sphere of life. It is not to be found separate from the pursuits of truth, justice, beauty, and selfhood. The sacred is more like the caffeine in the coffee than the cherry on top of a sundae. So the sacred is baked in, it's in the substance, it's in there. It's not this separate thing that you can pluck off the top. That was the cherry. The thing in there is the caffeine. It is in and among everything, the sacred. He says religion could be thought of as a self-conscious acknowledgement of the sacred, which makes sense, right? We do religion to acknowledge what is sacred. He says, in that case, there is no clear separation of the sacred and secular, yet there is still a role for the deliberate recognition of the presence of sacred things. So he doesn't see a strict line between the secular and sacred, but the point of religion is to really the deliberation, preferably religion involves other people, to deliberately recognize the presence of that which is sacred. And for him, that is the natural world. And religion can be practicing, deliberately recognizing the sacredness of the natural world. He says religious communities and their traditions, what we sometimes disparagingly call organized religions, are attempts to nurture and pass on the sense of the sacred. I find that to be very true. Each tradition has the times, people, and events which the tradition recognizes as sacred. That is when religions are at their best. So religious naturalism qualifies under all of these categories, having its own stories, its own events, its own cycles. It works. And another thing I really like that he says is that it seems that almost always sacred things have a dual aspect. They both challenge and support the people that acknowledge their sacredness. So if you hold something sacred, ideally, yes, you it's of support, it boosts, it lifts you up, it makes you feel better, it gives you a source of meaning, wants you to go on with life. But at the same time, if that sacred thing doesn't present a challenge to you to maybe be better, to think of things, think of different ways of being and doing, it might not be quite as worthy as a sacred thing. He says his version of religious naturalism, like all versions, must also speak to issues of social justice, environmental care, and he says repudiation of idolatry. That's some nice religious language. So, calling out the false idols, and even if you're not don't want to get that biblical, our society has a lot of false idols. He says religious naturalism can speak to all of these things, all of these social injustices and environmental degradation. And he says the religious naturalism can speak to these problems better than traditional theism. He says the sacred is found in the human and the non-human others, and its overriding importance undermines all the idols which our minds create. So that's the end of the quote. But he's saying that, if we look at the whole natural world as the ultimate thing, again, it undermines human hubris, and it undermines these false idols that we create often in our minds. What are the false idols? You could probably think of a few. Consumerism, competition, greed, all of those. So, getting away from the academics now, just as an experiment, I'd like you to imagine a world. Imagine a world. Sounds like a movie trailer. In which everyone believes that holiness and sacredness is found in the natural world, the universe. And everyone feels really connected with the natural world and people and all of the other living and non-living things in the universe. And then that is the ultimate. That's all there is. Nothing beyond that. How do you think this imaginary world would treat its people? How would it treat its environment? Seeing it as sacred and all there is, that there is nothing more than that. If everyone saw the natural world as holy and sacred and really understood and lived out how they were connected to the whole, do you think we would be having a climate crisis right now? Or I might say the indigenous peoples, again, not necessarily religious naturalists, or there's some things in common. If they were in charge, do you think we'd be in climate crisis right now? Probably not. Now, contrast this imaginary world with the actual world we're in today that prioritizes short-term gains over long-term sustainability. The society today that values individualism and consumerism and competition and capitalism, all these false idols. And these things have created escalating inequality. They've resulted in environmental degradation. They've resulted in the climate crisis. So I think that religious naturalists are definitely onto something here, just as the indigenous peoples, just as the earth-centered religions. We talk a lot about living into our, and that is out moments of oneness with nature in particular, because it gives us, some of the most hardened atheists still just cannot resist the sense of awe and wonder that is in being connected to something greater when it comes to the natural world. But religious naturalism asks more from us than simply that. All that by itself is great. But it asks us to feel and recognize this oneness almost all the time. That deep interdependence, with other living and non-living things, all the time. And it wants us to be ready to take in the experiences of sacredness and holiness that manifest right here in our daily lives. I think that's a little advice. That's something we could all try, is to really just be on the lookout for the sacred in every moment in all of life. And I really can't think of a better time in history for us to be aware of our connections to the whole, and how our connections to the whole should really inform our moral and ethical and religious responses to current events. I mean, denying our interdependence is not a viable long-term option. And perhaps as Unitarian Universalists, we're some of the best suited people to defend the interdependent web of which we are all a part. I hope may we see that as our own sacred mission and our own sacred duty. May it be so, and blessed be.